Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Kris. Today's video is called The Perfect Man, The Rise and Fall of Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was the Confederate president. Now, I'm doing a video on him because in my love of history, I visited the White House of the South, the Confederate White House in Richmond, and I cannot find a picture, so I don't know if I took one. I was there, I promise, took the tour, but I can't find a picture. But this is, that was my nephew. This was on my nephew's door. Why his door was closed. Slaying a dragon, keep out. I'm drowning, keep out. Eating a muffin. And he was talking to Katy Perry. So those were reasons why you couldn't go to his door. I did. It's unrelated. Okay, come on. Okay, so that's just so you know. Now, of course, he's buried in one of them, and then his wife is buried in the other, and then he's got like a daughter, stuff like that. But I show this, and it's freezing up on me. But anyways, I show that. I'm not a fan of Jefferson Davis. Not a fan of the Confederacy. I know that's, you know, some people here like him, respect him, whatever. I don't. But that doesn't mean I don't appreciate what he did for the country. Hear me out. I know people were like, what? Before he became president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis served in the military in the War of 1812 under future president Zachary Taylor. Fought against the natives all along up into Illinois. So I appreciate his service in terms of a soldier. I appreciate his service in terms of being a statesman. And I believe the inside of the Capitol, a lot of the gold and all the decorations were from him when he was on the subcommittee. They redecorated everything. And I believe a lot of that still today is from him. He was a good statesman. He was Secretary of War. Oh, I don't. Was it James Buchanan? No. Franklin Pierce, maybe? Might have been even been before that. Yeah, I don't remember. But anyways, the reason why I bring this up is because yesterday on my trip I went to the historical Jefferson Davis site. You saw my short, you saw I did the video where I visited the tower. But I bring that up because when I was in that tower looking down, what you can see right there, that red, which is very, it's a good picture, it's just you can't really see it. That's a church there. That church is on the home site of what was the birth site of Jefferson Davis. So while I was there, I got some stuff. And one of them, this is a Civil War firearm, model 1851 Colt Navy revolver. but I just hold it there. It's like brass, so it's pretty cool. This is a replica musket model 1861. So that's pretty cool. Spencer carbine, sorry. These are replicas. They're not real. So if I point this at you, you're not going to die. Because if it was real, man, human beings were a lot smaller 150 years ago. And then this is a Sharps carbine. But they were there. I thought they were cool. I did not get, one of the things that I typically get is a bookmark. I did not get a Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, or Stonewall Jackson bookmark. Couldn't convince myself. But I did get Jefferson Davis Historical Site, Fairview, Kentucky. The monument, dedicated June 7th, 1924. That was when it was finished. Okay, so I said it was 381 feet 8 inches. It's 351 feet. I was wrong. Width at the base is 36 feet 4 inches. Thickness of the walls at base is 7 feet. Apparently that's wrong. It's actually 9. Top of the shaft is 2 feet thick. Number of steps 489. I did not have to do that. I did the elevator, and I had a panic attack going up as soon as the elevator door closed. And she goes, yeah, it's about 3 minutes round trip up and down. And we're going up, and instantly my heart started racing, and I thought, I've never flown, so I've never been in something this high. And it was very uncomfortable. Calculated weight, it weighs 14,376 tons. So what is that, 28,000 pounds? Construction material, concrete. Years to complete project, 16 years. They had to stop for World War I. Total cost was $200,000. Elevator installed 1929, cost $20,000. And the architect was G.R. Gregg from Louisville, Kentucky. So we'll just throw that up there for now. And then this is a Civil War shot glass. I wish it wasn't blurry. Timeline, 1861. Fort Sumner, 1862. Or not 1862, it's Battle of Bull Run, and then it kind of goes through to the fall of Richmond, Appomattox, Lee surrenders. And then I got a magnet, but I also got a Liberty Bell. This is the real Liberty Bell too. A lot of people don't realize that. That's supposed to be the crack, but it's not cracked. So this is actually the real Liberty Bell. A lot of people are expecting it to be much bigger. You'd be incorrect. Okay, that bell is really annoying me. But this is what I'm actually really excited about. It is 2 books. Confederate Government, Volume 1. No, that's 1. And that's Volume 2. But what I like about it, it's written by Jefferson Davis. There you go. Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. So I'm really curious to see, and I think that is at the top of Lookout Mountain, overlooking Chattanooga. Or Chattanooga. That's how you say it. But I was flipping through, and I was like, oh yeah, this is definitely going to be a tough read. because it's got that old language. But wow, yeah. In conclusion, I tender to your excellency the assurance of my high consideration and regard, and am, sir, very respectfully, yours, etc., Jefferson Davis. So I'm excited to read about it, because from his point of view. We'll just put that there for right now. Get a lot of this stuff out of my way. I gotta put stuff on my shelf. Okay, so because of that, let's see A Perfect Man, about the life of, come on, Jefferson Davis.
Davis really is the perfect man in a time and in a place where there's a serious shortage of real quality leadership.
He really represented everything that the plantation South was about, right? He really believed in patriarchy. He believed in hierarchy.
Of course, Davis was in the U.S. Congress, U.S. Senate. He was in the Mexican War.
He's a military hero. He's tall, good looking, looks great on a horse. So in many...
I said the War of 1812. No. It was the Mexican War. The War of 1812, he would have been... Jeez. I don't even know. 3?
In many ways, he's perfect.
Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, was born on June 3rd, 1808 in Christian County, Kentucky.
Yeah, when he was a child, his father, Samuel Davis, moved the family to the vicinity of Woodville, Mississippi, where Davis grew to young manhood when he wasn't away attending school. Jefferson Davis's older brother, who was really a mentor and a father figure to him, Joseph Davis, managed to secure for Jefferson Davis an appointment to the military academy at West Point in, I believe, 1824. And Davis, as he was about a lot of things throughout his life, was ambivalent about going to West Point. At first he wanted to go, then he didn't want to go. He was going to West Point because his brother wanted him to go and he wanted to please his brother.
Despite his indecisiveness, Davis would eventually decide to attend West Point.
He was not a stellar student at West Point. He wasn't at the bottom of his class, but he was nowhere near the top. He was something of a party boy. A number of the West Point cadets, when they could, of course, for generations, would leave the post after hours when they weren't supposed to and go to a local tavern called Benny Havens, where they would drink. And the accommodating Mr. Havens would serve these young men whatever they asked for. He got caught out a couple of times. As a matter of fact, he was brought before a court-martial and dismissed once, then allowed back in on application.
In 1828, Davis graduated from the military academy at West Point and became a second lieutenant in the United States Army. In 1831, Davis was assigned to Fort Crawford at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. At Fort Crawford, Davis met Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of the fort's commanding officer, Colonel Zachary Taylor.
Moxie Taylor, as she was known, was the one true love of Davis's life.
Colonel Taylor did not approve of the relationship between Davis and his daughter. He arranged for the young lieutenant to be transferred to another assignment. Rather than accept his transfer, Davis resigned his commission and remained at Prairie du Chien.
He finally persuaded her family to allow her to marry him. They were married in Kentucky, and he then persuaded her that it was safe to go back to the plantation his brother had set up for him in Mississippi, not far from Vicksburg. Even though this is the summer in the South, even though Davis himself knew from experience that the summer in the South was the fever season, and he would himself manage to be away from that plantation in the summertime. She went south with him, and within a matter of 3 months, they'd both been infected with malaria. She died. He survived.
Sarah's death devastated Davis. Many years later, the sight of her slipper was enough to cause him to pass out from grief. Her death altered his personality forever.
The fun-loving, joyful, somewhat irreverent young man of his West Point days disappeared forever, and he became the sober, serious, taciturn Jefferson Davis that history really knows.
For the next 8 years, Davis lived in what he would later describe as great seclusion on his plantation in Mississippi. Gradually, Davis would begin to emerge from his shell. In 1843, he would run for a seat in the Mississippi House of Representatives. He lost this election, but at Christmas time visited his brother Joseph in Natchez and met Verena Banks Howell, the daughter of a family friend, Major William Howell.
Verena was in many ways a 20th century woman. She was bright, she was alert, she was accustomed to being involved with the men in political discussions of the day.
Though he was 18 years older than she was, Davis was intrigued by her intelligence and personality. Less than a month after meeting her, he proposed marriage and she accepted. A year later, they were married.
Relationship was very interesting from a 21st century perspective. Had very specific ideas about womanhood. He really represented everything that the plantation South was about, right? He really believed in patriarchy, he believed in hierarchy, and this was a hierarchy that was not only based on race, but based on sex, right? So that women were ultimately dependent on and subservient to men, right? He was the authority in his household. And Verena Howell Davis was not particularly interested in submitting to her husband. So they had quite a rocky marriage.
They separated twice. Davis left her at home in Mississippi once he's serving in Congress and went to Washington rather than take her with him because she was, as he put it, so querulous. After the second separation, I think Verena Davis came to the conscious decision to save the marriage by playing the game. And thereafter she spent years and years being the subservient, obsequious wife.
In 1846, a year after they were married, Davis re-enlisted in the Army. The United States was at war with Mexico, and by fighting in this war, Davis hoped to win honor and glory for himself. Davis was given command of a regiment of volunteers and assigned to the army of his former father-in-law, General Zachary Taylor. Taylor blamed Davis for the death of his daughter. Davis's regiment would distinguish itself at the Battle of Buena Vista on February 22, 1846. Davis's regiment was where the fighting was the hottest, and they defeated first one column of Mexican attackers and then a second. Davis himself was wounded in the foot and had to be carried off the battlefield. When General Zachary Taylor learned of his performance in the battle, he wrote to Davis, "My daughter, sir, was a better judge of character than I was."
He was lucky because what he did on the battlefield was stupid, but the Mexican commander facing him did something even dumber. And Davis lucked out and had a signal role in this great victory.
Based on his status as a war hero, in 1847 Davis was appointed to the Senate. In the Senate, he served as a member of the Armed Forces Committee. In 1853, President Franklin Pierce appointed Davis Secretary of War.
Was indeed a micromanager. He had the instincts of a bureaucrat.
which made him an excellent Secretary of War. After Pierce's term concluded in 1856, Davis returned to the Senate. He was still serving in the Senate when he learned of the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860.
December 1860, South Carolina seceded from the United States. So in January, 5 other states seceded from the Union.
Among those 5 seceding states was Davis's home state of Mississippi. Davis would later recall that the day he learned of Mississippi's secession was the saddest of his life. Nevertheless, he wrote a letter to the governor stating, "Judge best where Mississippi needs me and place me accordingly." Davis was resigning from the Senate. Delegates from the 6 newly independent states were meeting in Montgomery, Alabama.
They created the Confederate government and the Confederate States of America. And Montgomery sort of became, by default almost, the capital of the Confederacy because that's where those men convened.
There wasn't a lot of talk about Davis in Montgomery, Alabama. Most people apparently thought that the president would come from Georgia because Georgia was the biggest state. And Georgians mostly seemed to think the president would be former Senator Robert Toombs, who fit this kind of mid-19th century ideal of the larger-than-life man, boastful, outgoing, the master of the bon mot, the life of the party, a great backslapper and a great campaigner. But, Toombs had a problem with drink. He couldn't handle it. And a day or two before the president was to be chosen by this small convention, he got drunk at a party and made a fool of himself. So Toombs almost virtually drank himself out of the presidency. Into this vacuum that a man from Mississippi comes riding up with a letter Davis has written to him in response to some questions, and the letter says, among other things, he would have preferred to be a general in the field rather than to be president, because he felt that's where his inclinations and his skills were. But if my country calls, I can't say no. And Davis really is the perfect man in a time and in a place where there's a serious shortage of real quality leadership. He's a plantation owner and a slave owner, so he's part of the group who are bringing about this new experiment. He's a military hero. He's tall, good looking. So in many ways, he's perfect.
He's a former Secretary of War, so you got a guy who you believe, in terms of your country waging war, you've got a guy who knows how to do that. Also, I want to say 65% of the soldiers who fought in the Mexican-American War, which was 1846 to 1848, even though now we're talking about 1860, 65% of those men were from the South. It might have been more, but I think it was 65% were from the South. So you have the South basically saying, we had the military. We have the military has always been the South. So they're very confident going into it, as they should be. They had the soldiers.
And when his name is put in nomination, it almost immediately carries the day.
So on February 18th, 1861, which was George Washington's birthday, Jefferson Davis was sworn in as President of the Confederacy. In his inaugural address, Davis stated that the South wished to live in peace with all the
That's actually real.
nations of the world, but would fight for its independence if it had to. But the cheers quickly turned to sorrow. The shelling of Fort Sumter on April 14, 1861, marked the beginning of the Civil War. By April of 1865, it is clear that the South is going to lose the Civil War. The Union Army of the Potomac has advanced to the gates of the Confederate capital at Richmond.
They slowly but surely.
Sorry, there's a great story about Robert E. Lee came to the White House of the South, the Confederate White House, and he kind of stormed in. And he was telling he was telling Jefferson Davis, we have to go, Richmond's going to fall. And he had been in church, came back and was getting stuff. Robert E. Lee came there, because I don't know if Robert E. Lee knew if the message got to him. And he storms in, and he storms in, Robert E. Lee does, with mud on his boots. And the wife, Varina, I already forgot her saying it, Varina, I want to say. She looked over and then looked down, and then was just like, "Oh, am I gonna clean this? What have you done? Look what you're dirtying up everything." And he just, like, Robert E. Lee just looked at her, and he's like, "There's other things to worry about," and he made sure they got out of there. I heard that when I was on tour at the Confederate White House. I found it funny.
Literally stretched out the Union line. The objective was to seize the various railroads that led into either Petersburg or Richmond, cutting off supplies and forcing the Confederate Army, Lee's army, to abandon the trenches there and flee.
By April 2nd, the Union Army had cut all the railroads into Richmond. At dawn, General Ulysses S. Grant ordered a general assault. On the morning of April 2nd, Jefferson Davis was attending church at St. Paul's Episcopal. Where he received a telegram from General Robert E. Lee informing him that Petersburg and Richmond had to be evacuated.
He knew what was coming. He had been planning for this, even though when it actually came, he delayed accepting it. He sent Lee a telegram asking Lee for more time. He met with his cabinet, he met with the mayor of Richmond, he met with the governor of Virginia, he met with military men, including General Dick Ewell, and then went to the railroad station and spent some more time at the railroad, spending some time in the railroad president's office, and then didn't actually leave Richmond until about 11 p.m.
His goal was to keep the Confederacy alive, even if there's, a corporal's guard still out in the field somewhere that's independent, standing guard over a few square feet of soil that's still Confederate, then the Confederacy is still alive.
So Davis's train reached Danville at about 5 p.m. the next day. He was met in Danville by a committee of citizens, including the mayor, James M. Walker. The mayor and this committee of citizens led Davis to the home of Danville's richest citizen, Major William Sutherland. Sutherland provided Davis with a room and the use of his office. Davis spent the next 7 days trying to rally the citizens of the Confederacy to continue the fight. To this end, he published a proclamation declaring that if we but will it, we are free. But Davis was not in a comfortable position. It had been several days since he heard from General Robert E. Lee. On April 7th, he convened a cabinet meeting in the Sutherland House to discuss the situation. While they were meeting, a young sergeant, John Sergeant Wise, the son of a former governor, was led into the house and presented to Davis a report on the condition of Lee's army. Sergeant Wise told Davis that after the fall of Petersburg, Lee had attempted to move south to link up with him at Danville. However, General Ulysses S. Grant had blocked Lee's path to the south. Lee therefore had moved to the west, toward Appomattox Courthouse. By the morning of April 9th, 1865, Lee's army was surrounded at Appomattox. In an attempt to break this encirclement, Lee launched a desperate assault. Lee's tired, hungry troops were unable to defeat Grant's superior forces, and when the attack failed, Lee had no choice but to meet with Grant and negotiate the terms for the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia.
Essentially, the loss of Lee's army is the end of the war for the Confederacy. Lee's army had become, in the minds of Southern people, in the minds of, I should say, in the minds of Confederate people, to be, it was the symbol of Confederate sustainability, the revolution's survivability, and once Lee's army was defeated, the cause was lost.
Davis learned of Lee's surrender on April 10th. Still determined to continue the Civil War, Davis headed south, hoping to meet with General Joseph E. Johnson. Johnson was the commander of the South's largest surviving army. At the beginning of the Civil War, Davis and Johnson had had a strong relationship. They had known each other during the old Army days, and Davis had appointed Johnson commander of one of the South's field armies.
Johnston and Davis hated each other. And by that I mean Johnston really hated him, and Davis didn't care for him in return.
However, in the winter of 1861, a series of misunderstandings and miscommunications between the two men had significantly undermined their relationship. By 1865, Davis and Johnson were at each other's throats. Their meeting on April 10, 1865, would prove just as contentious as previous engagements. Johnson urged Davis to negotiate terms of surrender with the Union, which Davis refused to consider.
I think he was constitutionally incapable of giving up. Part of the reason being that he viewed the Confederacy as his creation. The Confederacy was his child, just like one of his sons. And Davis is a man who will have 4 sons and will see all of them die. And I think to him it was no more conceivable that he could oversee the death of the Confederacy than that he could willingly give up one of his sons to die.
Davis eventually agreed to allow Johnson to meet with William Tecumseh Sherman, the commander of a Union army. Davis remained at Johnson's headquarters in Greensboro for a few days and then headed south on April 15, 1865. In Washington, D.C., President Abraham Lincoln was taking in a night at the theater to celebrate his victory. During the third act, a young actor named John Wilkes Booth ascended the staircase to the president's box and shot the president in the back of the head.
No.
Lincoln died the next morning. Lincoln's assassination would greatly intensify the manhunt for Jefferson Davis. Many Northerners believed that Davis was the mastermind behind Booth's plot to assassinate the president. But Davis would only learn of Lincoln's assassination on April 20th. Davis's reaction to this assassination was somewhat mixed. He believed that Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, was a beast of a man, but that he would ultimately have less influence on the government than Lincoln did. Davis also hoped that Lincoln's assassination would inspire the South to rise up and continue the fight. Hope would prove vain, however. On April 26th, General Johnson had met with William Tecumseh Sherman at Bennett Place, North Carolina, and surrendered his army. When Davis learned of this, he headed south into Georgia.
Who becomes, really after February or March 1865, intermittently, I think, delusional. We'll start talking about riding across Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, and that phantom legions of Confederate men who had deserted or who had been sent home sick or furloughed ill, or men who'd avoided the draft because they were Unionists, would suddenly take heart and come out of the hills to form a new army with him as its nucleus. That's just a pipe dream.
May 4th, Davis reached the small town of Washington, Georgia. There he convened a meeting of his cabinet in the courthouse. He tried to convince his cabinet to cross the Mississippi with him and continue the Civil War.
All saying the game is over. It's time to give up. It's time to get you out of the country, and time to surrender our forces everywhere.
They tried to convince him to take a ship to Havana, Cuba. When Davis left Washington that same day, he seemed to be following their advice.
It's pretty evident that in fact he's talking about using that boat to get across the Gulf of Mexico to Texas, where there is still, he believes, a large Confederate army under General Kirby Smith.
morning of May 9th, Davis, who had met Verena 2 days earlier, arrived at a clearing a mile north of Irwinville, Georgia. Tired from a long day of marching, they encamped along the banks of a small stream. Unbeknownst to the Confederate president, for several days he had been pursued by 2 regiments of Union cavalry. Sensing an opportunity to capture him, the 2 regiments took up positions on opposite sides of the camp. At dawn, they attacked. Poor communication between the regiments, however, caused them to open fire at each other. Taking advantage of this confusion, Davis attempted to flee the camp. But a Union soldier spotted him and commanded him to stop. Davis rushed toward the man in an attempt to overpower him, but Verena intervened by throwing herself between the 2 men. Davis therefore had no choice but to surrender.
There's of course been a long-standing notion that Jefferson Davis, on May 10th, 1865 at Irwinville, Georgia, attempted to escape capture by wearing one of his wife's dresses. This is, of course, nonsense. It's always been nonsense. And even the Union cavalryman, whose name I believe was Munger, M-U-N-G-E-R, who captured him, later said Davis was not wearing a dress. He was wearing a coat called a raglan, R-A-G-L-A-N, named after the famous Lord Raglan who commanded the charge of the Light Brigade. And what better way to tarnish a man's ability to be a hero than to say that at the end he was a coward who tried to escape in a woman's dress. And that's a myth that really played into the needs of the Union War Department.
After his capture on May 10th, Davis was taken to Fortress Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. He spent the next 2 years confined in a small cell inside the fort.
You can't execute Jefferson Davis. Lincoln wanted Davis to escape. He didn't want to have to try him because if he tried him for treason and Davis was convicted, he might have to execute him, which made Davis a martyr.
Ultimately, Jefferson Davis is charged with treason, but he's never actually tried. He's released on bail, and nothing ever comes of the charges after the 2 years in prison.
After his release, Davis and Verena spent several years traveling in Europe. After his return to the United States, Davis became the president of an insurance company. The insurance company went bankrupt, however, and in order to make some money, Davis published his memoirs, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. The book was not a success. However, the wealthy widow Sarah Dorsey left Davis her plantation, so he lived out the final years of his life in relative comfort. Davis died in 1889 and was buried in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia.
You know, I disagree with Jefferson Davis's life when he gave a very powerful speech to the House or to the Senate, to Congress, just before he resigned. And it was a very good speech. But right after that speech, that's where I lost him. Or that's where he lost me. But leading up to it, I can't throw his whole life away because of what happened at the end, but I can say that he deserves a lot of respect for for the sacrifices that he made leading up to that. Don't agree with it, but clearly I like to understand, you know, a lot of the presidents that I've been to, and he's not a president, but a lot of the presidents that I've been to, I don't necessarily agree with the things that they've done, but I want to read about them and try to understand why they did things. And that makes it a little bit easier to, you got to put yourself in their shoes and understand why they did certain things. That's just my belief. But we're going to go ahead and end it. What did I say? We're going to go ahead and end it here. And like and subscribe. I know this video will not be viewed by many, but I think it's still a video that does need to be viewed, be understood. He's a person who like I said, the first part of his life, he was excellent. He was an excellent statesman. He was a soldier. And then he went with the Confederacy. But, you know, when I visit the graves, I always talk to the graves. It's just something that I do. When I went there, I didn't like, oh, you're a terrible person and I'm glad you're dead. And did it. No, I was just like, I appreciated what you did for the country leading up to it. I disagree with your stance on the Confederacy and everything like that, but you made your decisions based on what you believed was right, so I can't. I'm not someone that will judge you for that. And I would say the same thing if I went to wherever Hitler would be buried, which he's not. I would say the same thing there. You did your thing coming up to it. You fought in World War I, blah, blah, blah. You could have been so different. You could have been this. You could have been that. And this was the road you chose to go down. And so I disagree with that. But once the person's dead, what's left is just the vessel, just the shell. And so I'm not one to disrespect that. Even his grave, I wouldn't. If I was the only person on the planet, I wouldn't disrespect the grave. Just because I wouldn't disrespect anyone's grave, regardless of if it could have been Hitler, I wouldn't disrespect the grave. You know, that's just how I feel. I don't know how that got brought into it, but I brought it up apparently. So I'm gonna end this here. Like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Have a good night.